Trump scores a major win and is pushed to broadly detain migrants apprehended by ICE. What does it mean for the president's immigration agenda? And could the Supreme Court now intervene? Also, Sam Bankman-Freed, the crypto mogul, he's back in court asking for a new trial. It comes nearly 2 years after he was sentenced. Why now? And does he have a real shot? Plus, a grand jury has refused to indict 6 Democratic lawmakers. This is a rare move. We'll break it down, talk about why it matters, and what could be next for Arizona Senator Mark Kelly. I'm Zach Schonfeld, legal affairs reporter here at The Hill, and each week here on the Gavel, we break down how the courts are shaping national politics and how the politics are shaping the courts. And I'm joined by my fellow partner in covering crime, legal affairs reporter here at The Hill, Ella Lee. You can get our newsletter, The Gavel, in your inbox every Wednesday morning by signing up at thehill.com/newsletters. All right, Ella, this week, should we start with immigration?
Let's get into it.
All right, let's get to it. I want to get in just a moment to the big ruling that we got this past week from the Fifth Circuit on President Trump's mandatory detention policy. But before we talk about that ruling from the Fifth Circuit, I thought I'd just set the stage here a little bit and walk through the tidal wave, frankly, of litigation that you and I have been following now over these past few months. So the Trump administration has now, of course, upended what has been 30 years of how past administrations have interpreted federal immigration law. Past administrations have interpreted federal law to mean that for many migrants, when they are apprehended by ICE in enforcement actions, for many of these migrants who had been in the U.S. for a long period of time and were only discovered years later, the government has used discretion to release them as they fight their deportation proceedings. Then came the second Trump administration, now implementing this mandatory detention policy, saying that with very few exceptions, when a migrant is apprehended in these ICE enforcement operations, the government is compelled to detain them without bond as they fight their deportations. This has, of course, been a massive shift now. And Ella, I know you've been watching what has now been hundreds, I think now the count might even be thousands of cases that have been filed over this.
Yeah, the courts have been absolutely swamped with cases stemming from Trump's aggressive immigration policies, and we've really started to see the downstream effect of that in recent weeks. It's this double-edged sword where Justice Department lawyers are drowning in their caseloads from the influx in migrants' challenges to their detentions, but on the flip side, we're seeing judges really get frustrated because of how could they have not seen this coming is sort of what the judges are saying. So we saw a really stark example of this last week in St. Paul, Minnesota, where a Justice Department lawyer literally told a judge that she wished he'd hold her in contempt so she'd get a full 24 hours of sleep. She said her job sucks, the system sucks, and she's giving basically everything she's got to get the judge information, but it's still not enough for the judges who are handling, hundreds and, like you said, probably thousands at this point of these cases. So that lawyer, Julie Lee, she's since been removed from her post, but this certainly doesn't start or end with her. This is an issue that's sort of we're seeing across the board.
I mean, what an extraordinary comment there to hear a government attorney in court saying my job sucks, the system sucks. I mean, I just can't think of any similar comment that I've ever heard like that from a government attorney before. So quite shocking comments there. So up until this point, if we were to be having this conversation, maybe even just a week ago, we would have been talking about how the Trump administration has almost always been losing. Judges over and over again in these hundreds of cases have, for the most part, been siding with migrants, saying that they are entitled to a bond hearing or have to be released. But then all of a sudden now the picture is changing. Last Friday night, the Fifth Circuit, which is regarded as the nation's most conservative federal appeals court, has endorsed the Trump administration's view of federal law, agreeing with them about this mandatory detention policy, saying that this is authorized under the tough immigration laws that Congress passed back in 1996. This was a 2-to-1 panel on the Fifth Circuit. We had the 2 Republican appointees on the panel signing with the Trump administration. It was a Reagan appointee and a Trump appointee. And then you had the panel's sole Democratic appointee, a Biden-appointed judge, in dissent. So a decision along ideological lines. Bottom line now, Ella, Fifth Circuit has endorsed the view here, endorsing the legality of this mandatory detention policy. Fifth Circuit, it only covers 3 states, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, but this could still be a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, as you alluded to, this is a big ruling, not just because on face value it's a major victory for the Trump administration, but also because of which courts handed down the ruling and where that court is based. So, this is a decision from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is regarded as the most conservative federal appeals court in the country. It covers Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas, which means that the decision impacts migrants detained there. Now, why is this important? Well, the Trump administration has had a pattern of moving many migrants apprehended across the country to Texas and to Louisiana. And since we have the ruling covering these states, it's pretty likely that if this pattern keeps up, we're going to see a much broader effect begin to take form as a result of this ruling, because it's not really just migrants who are living in Texas, Louisiana, or Mississippi who could end up being affected if we're seeing people sort of move to those states.
Absolutely. No doubt this is going to impact a lot of these cases and migrants that we've seen, a lot of these cases coming through the Fifth Circuit. But meanwhile, we've also started to see some of these migrants, Ella, have a plan B, going to judges saying that even if you accept that Fifth Circuit decision that was issued just this past Friday night, endorsing the government's view with its mandatory detention policy, saying that that would violate their due process rights under the Constitution. And we've already seen one judge, one of these district judges under the Fifth Circuit, say, look at that ruling from the Fifth Circuit and say, yeah, that doesn't change the case. His due process rights in this case are still being violated. So far, at least one judge has agreed that some of these migrants still might be entitled to be released as they fight their deportation proceedings. But meanwhile, as that battle plays out on due process and migrants start having to try this backup argument, this new ruling is also teeing up the question of whether this is going to get to the Supreme Court. The Fifth Circuit ruling is now in. These migrants, if they wanted to, can appeal this ruling directly to the Supreme Court. We don't know yet if they're going to do so. And then it would be up to the 9 justices as to whether they want to take this up. The Supreme Court, of course, gets to decide what cases it wants to hear as it turns away the vast majority. And Ella, I don't know about you, but to me, there's some reasons to think they might take this, some reasons to have some pause. As I think about it, this is a big decision. It's been a big issue, really impacting the courts. So it's going to get a lot of attention. But at the same time, a lot of the cases that the Supreme Court takes up is to resolve splits between the lower appeals courts. And this is just one circuit. We don't have a lot of other rulings yet from all of these other circuits. And so maybe the Supreme Court is going to say, we want to let this issue percolate a little bit more. We want to let some of these other courts weigh in. So that gives me one reason for pause. I don't know. What do you think about this? How real do you think is the chance that this could get to the Supreme Court soon?
I think one thing we know for sure is it's not going to be this term. There's not enough, I don't think, on the table for the justices to really start taking a look at this point. But I think you're absolutely right that this is an issue that might end up warranting their review. There's a chance they'll want to see more, but even still, they've got a busy docket on ahead of them, and so this is something we're going to be watching, I think, for a little bit before it gets all the way up to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, for sure. That April argument calendar at the Supreme Court just coming out just a few hours ago, the last few regularly scheduled, at least, argument sessions of the term. All right, so we've talked a lot about immigration. Let's shift gears quite to a different topic and to a case we haven't talked about in a while, and that is the case of Sam Bankman-Freed, because he is back in court this week with a motion for a new trial. But let's just start by going back in time, because it's been some time since we've chatted about SBF. First of all, just walk us through, how did we get to this point? What landed SBF in jail, for anyone who doesn't quite remember?
Yeah, so Sam Bankman-Freed, where to begin? Long story short, he founded FTX, a cryptocurrency exchange, and for a time he was really celebrated as a poster boy for crypto. But that all started crumbling in 2022 when the Securities and Exchange Commission charged him with orchestrating a scheme to defraud equity investors. So that went to trial, and in 2023 he was convicted on charges of basically knowingly deceiving customers and investors about what was happening with their money. Prosecutors said he took billions of dollars of FTX customers' money and sent it to his hedge fund, Alameda Research, to use that money for risky investments, political donations, and more. And that money was lost when the bets failed. So he was ultimately sentenced to 25 years in prison. He's been serving that out since. And of course, now we're seeing him sort of seeking a new trial. And that's where we sort of get into this new leg of his story.
A new leg indeed, a new motion filed this week with his trial judge, which is interesting because this isn't, procedurally speaking, quite super normal. I mean, he is currently fighting this on appeal up to the Second Circuit. The Second Circuit has heard oral arguments. We're just waiting on a decision there. But this is now like a second track to fight his conviction being taken simultaneously in the trial court. I mean, I'm not even sure it'll be procedurally proper given how long it's been since that conviction came in. So this motion was quite striking indeed. And the other thing that you and I have been talking about, it's striking about this motion, is the fact that this motion, as opposed to the other stages of this case, Sam Bankman-Fried doesn't have any lawyers representing him on this motion. It is his signature.
But you know who he does have is he has his mom, who is the one who submitted this motion to the court for him. She's a law professor at Stanford Law School. And she's not, as far as we can tell, involved in the case, but she did submit this motion to the court for him, citing his incarceration as a reason he couldn't do it himself. So yeah, this is not the type of motion that you expect to see in a case where the defendant was really well defended the first time around by high-powered lawyers. And now, you know, he's heading into court himself. This motion wasn't signed by any lawyers, like you mentioned. And he's sort of going out on a leg on his own here. And, you know, we can discuss why that might be, but I have some ideas.
So let's discuss why that might be. And
Yeah.
you know, one thing is you read this motion, and one of the things also is you go through this motion, it attacks the judge here who this motion is going to, asking for a new trial. Judge Lewis Kaplan, who serves in the Southern District of New York and oversaw this trial. And Ella, I've got to tell you, as I read this motion, I wonder who the real audience is. Is it really the judge here in this case, or is Sam Bankman-Fried talking to someone else? Because as I read through this new motion, there is a lot of talk about the justice system being weaponized against him. And as we look to other defendants who have tried to get presidential pardons from President Trump, this is a strategy we've seen work in the past for some of these defendants, making these weaponization arguments. And we know the president has said it himself. If he sees that someone he thinks was treated unfairly in the justice system, you know, he says that he is willing to help. And, you know, another thing that strikes me here about all of this is this just isn't just any judge here that we're talking about. This is Judge Lewis Kaplan, who Donald Trump knows very well, because Judge Lewis Kaplan was also the judge who oversaw E. Jean Carroll's civil trials against the president. The president even attended one of those trials. He has spent days in the courtroom with Judge Kaplan. I have been in the courtroom with the two of them. And I mean, I have seen the president, shaking his head, making audible comments. He was no fan of this judge. So I don't know. It's quite interesting now as Sam Bankman-Fried goes on the attack against Judge Kaplan. And you've got to wonder, would this fall on sympathetic ears with the president? So I don't know. What do you think? I mean, you got to compare that to also the fact that Sam Bankman-Fried has a long history of donating to Democrats. I mean, what do you think? Could we get to a pardon here?
Yeah, I mean, look, Trump may be picky with the Democrats that he's pardoned, but he has pardoned Democrats. He pardoned former Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich, who I was on a plane with last weekend. He pardoned Congressman Henry Queller. He pardoned P.G. Sittenfeld, a former Cincinnati Council's member whose case is now before the Supreme Court. He also commuted the sentence of former Detroit Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick, and his Justice Department dropped its case against New York City Mayor Eric Adams, former New York City Mayor Eric Adams, for those same reasons, for, you know, this idea that the Justice Department was sort of weaponized against him and it wasn't a prosecution that needed to happen. But it's not like everyone who's asked one has been granted one, even when they are sort of pulling on those strings of a weaponized Justice Department. Notably, Trump has not pardoned former Senator Bob Menendez, New Jersey Democrat, who we know sought one for quite some time. So if Sam Bankman-Fried does have a case to make to the president, I think that he's trying to do it in these court filings. And the first sentence of the motion, as you said, it references a weaponized Justice Department. We've heard Trump talk about that many, many times related to his own personal legal troubles. And so I think that SBF here, he's got a chance at getting a pardon, but it's by no means a done deal. And I think it really is going to be up to the president's whim, as all pardons are.
Mm-hmm. Well, we will be watching this one for sure, and watching the president's Truth Social feed to see if, like many of these other defendants, whether we hear about a pardon here. All right, Ella, let's shift gears because I did want to quickly get your take on some news that we have just had here in the last 24 hours, and that is a federal grand jury declining to indict 6 Democratic lawmakers who filmed that video instructing military service members to refuse illegal orders. This has been a story we have been talking about for weeks, but now this significant development here with this grand jury refusing to indict, something we don't see very often, but it seems nowadays it's becoming increasingly more common.
Yeah, I mean, to take a step back, it's extremely rare for grand juries to reject indictments. There's this old legal adage that a prosecutor can get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich, and that's because at this grand jury stage, it's just the government that's putting on a case. And grand jurors are only deciding whether charges are warranted, not, if a person is guilty or not guilty. And so we heard today from Mark Kelly and Alyssa Slotkin, two of the Democrats who are being targeted by this probe, at a press conference. And they were expressing both frustration with the Trump administration for pursuing the charges, which they say are baseless, but also this real sort of dig your heels in spirit about pushing back. They reiterated several times that they're less worried about Trump's attacks on them, and they're more worried about what a successful indictment or prosecution would mean for others who speak out against the president. So, as you alluded, it's becoming increasingly more common for grand juries to reject charges they see as an overreach from the Justice Department, particularly in D.C. We've seen several grand juries reject felony charges or charges altogether sought by the U.S. Attorney's Office here amid the federal crackdown on local crime in the nation's capital. We also saw it in Virginia with efforts to reindict New York Attorney General Letitia James, who's a Democrat herself as well. So this refusal, it's a big loss for prosecutors. I think it speaks a lot to how ordinary people called on to hear these allegations view them, which it seems like not with much merit. But the rejection doesn't stop prosecutors from trying again if they so choose. So this may not be a closed case.
And as we've been watching this grand jury in the federal courthouse in D.C., it's not the only case with this battle over this video that is now unfolding in the Pretty Men Courthouse, the federal courthouse in the nation's capital. I know you've been watching this other case involving Arizona Senator Mark Kelly, specifically over his military history and now his fight with the Pentagon. What can you tell us about that case and where we're headed in that?
Yeah, so Mark Kelly's lawsuit has nothing to do with the Justice Department probe. It has to do with this Pentagon effort to punish him through their own channels. And that's primarily by censuring him and lowering his retirement rate. So it might seem like this is Mark Kelly's fight alone, but as we heard from him earlier today, I think that really sort of echoes throughout this other case as well, because there really is a lot more at stake than just his own personal military ranking. And so since this is sort of an untested area of law, the judge overseeing the case has repeatedly said that there are lots of novel issues to address here. But a ruling against Kelly would essentially extend the government's crackdown on his speech and his retirement to all service members. And so that means any veterans who currently speak out against the government would be at risk of punishments similar to those sought by the Pentagon against Kelly. And we actually saw the Justice Department at a hearing last week double down when pressed on that very issue. The Justice Department said that essentially retirees are not separated from the military, and thus they're still accountable to it. And so that would be a total shift from the way that retired service members conduct themselves today. Many retired service members run for Congress. Many are advocates for various social issues. And all those people would now be potentially, if this doesn't go Mark Kelly's way, all those people, because this law has not really been fleshed out, all those people would be at risk of facing sort of scrutiny from the Pentagon. So that fight is very much ongoing. And at that same press conference, Alyssa Slotkin, she's a former CIA analyst, she said that, several times that she also reserves her right to sue. And so there may be another fight that's sort of on the horizon here, but that's something we're going to have to watch for.
Well, reserve her right to sue. We will see. I've seen people say that before when they actually mean that and follow through. Sometimes they don't. So we will see. Let's shift gears to another big story that has come out this week. Quite a twist here. And this is a story that we originally had talked about back last fall. And this involves a judge, a now former judge, who had been serving on the federal bench in Massachusetts. And this was a Reagan-appointed judge. His name is Mark Wolf. He had served on the bench for about 4 decades, since 1985. And he made a lot of headlines last fall when he announced that he was resigning because of Donald Trump. When he stepped down, he had issued this piece in The Atlantic. And I'm just going to read you right from that piece from The Atlantic last November. He said his reason for stepping down was, quote, simple. I no longer can bear to be restrained by what judges can say publicly or do outside the courtroom. He went on to say that President Donald Trump is using the law for partisan purposes, targeting his adversaries while sparing his friends and donors from investigation, prosecution, and possible punishment. When this came out in The Atlantic was quite a statement from none other than a Reagan-appointed judge. But now we've got a twist this week, Ella, with a new investigation coming out from NPR that says that when this judge stepped down, there was a misconduct investigation going on into him. The NPR is reporting that we know that there was an inquiry into some unnamed judge out there about a hostile work environment. But NPR is now reporting, according to a source familiar with the inquiry who spoke anonymously to NPR, saying that the judge here in question is Wolf. So now this raises, of course, the question is, when he issued this Atlantic piece claiming to the world that he was resigning from the bench because of Donald Trump, was he really telling the truth? Or was this a result of this misconduct investigation, which has now been closed because he's no longer on the bench? I mean, Ella, what do you think? I mean, this has been such a narrative we've been talking about ever since the President Trump has been in office, with all of these Reagan-appointed judges, a lot of them like Judge Wolf, pushing back against the Trump administration.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, we have seen a number of Reagan judges really critically speak out against the Trump administration's conduct in several cases. And a lot of outlets, including us, have pushed back or have sort of pointed out this push and pull between, a Reagan appointed judge, appointed probably some of the oldest judges on the bench, appointed by a Republican, who are really doubling down and sort of giving these unabashed criticisms of the Trump administration. So when Wolf resigned, he was clumped into that group by many, including us. And, if NPR's reporting is right, it really upends the notion that this was sort of a cut and dry issue. And it seems a whole lot likelier that this departure was not as clear as it initially seemed.
Well, quite a twist indeed. It does seem, though, that this investigation is no longer, because Judge Wolf is no longer on the bench. Whatever the merits of this investigation would have been. Even though this investigation, though, is closing, it does tee up. I did want to mention just briefly the fact that we actually do have another misconduct investigation into another judge, completely different subject here. But we've been following for quite a while now. So just want to give an update. This is in the case of U.S. Circuit Judge Pauline Newman. She serves on the federal circuit. This is a specialty appeals court. It got a lot of attention because it's the court that heard the tariffs case on appeal. She has been suspended from the federal bench because her colleagues have concerns about her mental fitness. Judge Pauline Newman, she is 98 years old. There had been an investigation into her. And after her colleagues said she was mentally unfit and said she couldn't hear new cases, Pauline Newman, she is now actually suing her fellow judges, saying that is unconstitutional and that they can't do that. This has now been actually a years-long fight that, Ella, you and I have been following. And, I had to check on the docket when we talked about this other judge's investigation just to get an update on Pauline Newman. So here's the update. The D.C. Circuit has now finished the appeal. They have rejected her appeal. They did so on December 29th. That now starts the 90-day clock for Judge Pauline Newman to bring this issue to the Supreme Court. So that gives her until just about the end of March to file that appeal. So even though the story about the Judge Wolf investigation might be coming to a close, that'll be one to watch there with Judge Pauline Newman. All right, Ella, before we go for today, I did want to just go through and think about this next week and talk about what's on each of our radars and on the docket for the next week. I'll start with the thing that is most in my mind as we get into this next week, and that is I'll be watching the Supreme Court docket this week. I will be watching their emergency docket because we have now had a big emergency case that has been pending for about 3 weeks now. This is a case in which a group of California parents have gone to the Supreme Court asking them for an emergency order preventing California from blocking teachers from telling parents when their child socially transitions in the classroom. This is a case with big implications for parental rights and transgender rights. But like I said, it's been pending now on the Supreme Court's emergency docket for 3 weeks. Still no ruling. I'll be watching this week to see whether that ruling finally comes in. Ella, what are you going to be watching for this week?
Yeah, so before we even get into next week, tomorrow I'm going to be watching for the arraignment of Zubair al-Bakush. He's a suspect in the 2012 attack on the U.S. consulate in Benghazi, Libya. He was extradited last week to the United States to face charges related to murder, terrorism, arson. And this was made a big deal by the Justice Department. Attorney General Pam Bondi called him one of the key participants of that attack, which has really captivated the minds of Americans. And 4 people died. And so this is something that people have been seeking justice for quite some time. And I think that this is going to be one to watch. He's due in court tomorrow afternoon in Washington, D.C., and I'll be there.
Well, next week, looking forward to asking you all about what happens and unfolds in that courtroom. All right, well, I think that does it for us today. So much happening in the courts on immigration, the criminal docket, and everything else. Make sure to sign up for the Gavel newsletter. You can get it in your inbox every Wednesday morning by signing up at thehill.com/newsletters. But that does it for us this week as we break down how the courts are shaping national politics and how politics are shaping the courts. We'll be back next week.